John Miller stood at the mirror in his small apartment bathroom. His fingers moved with practiced ease as he adjusted his tie and straightened the medals on his chest. The dark blue dress uniform still fit him well, even 7 years after leaving active duty. At 38, his body remained strong, though the mirror showed a few more lines around his eyes than when he had first put on the uniform at 19. Today was not a day John had been looking forward to. He was going to say goodbye to his friend. Staff Sergeant Peter Collins had survived 3 tours alongside John in Afghanistan, only to lose his battle with cancer last week. John took a deep breath and touched the gold medal that sat just above his heart, the one he and Peter had received together after that terrible day in Kandahar. "I'll see you soon, brother," John whispered to his reflection. The July heat hit him like a wall when he stepped outside. Portland summers were nothing like the dry heat of Afghanistan, but the thick, humid air made his wool uniform uncomfortable within minutes. John decided to walk the 15 blocks to the church rather than drive. The movement helped calm his mind, and Peter had always loved walking through the city. The memorial service was both beautiful and painful. Peter's wife, Karen, hugged John for a long time afterward. Their 2 children stood nearby, the older boy looking so much like his father that it made John's chest ache. "He always said you saved his life over there," Karen whispered. John shook his head. "It was the other way around, more times than I can count." After promising to visit soon, John left the church. He decided to take a different route back to his apartment, one that would lead him through the downtown area and past the river, Peter's favorite view of the city. John needed time to process his grief before returning to the emptiness of his apartment. As he walked, John noticed how people reacted to his uniform. Some nodded respectfully. Others looked away quickly. A few older men offered small salutes. John wasn't wearing the uniform for attention. It was simply the proper way to honor Peter, but he couldn't help noticing the invisible wall the uniform created between him and everyone else. At the corner of Main Street and Pine Avenue, John saw the protest. About 30 people had gathered in the small plaza with signs and megaphones. This wasn't unusual in Portland, where people often demonstrated for various causes. John had no problem with protests. Freedom of speech was among the rights he had sworn to defend. He decided to cross to the other side of the street to give them space. The protesters seemed focused on military spending and foreign policy. Their signs showed pictures of damaged buildings overseas and statistics about defense budgets. A young man with a megaphone led chants about peace and justice. John understood their concerns even if he didn't agree with all their points. His own feelings about the wars he had fought in were complicated. As John passed the plaza, a young woman near the edge of the group noticed him. Heather Davis had been protesting every weekend for the past month. At 26, she was passionate about changing the world. Her brother had nearly joined the military 4 years ago, and the thought of losing him to a war she believed was unjust had fueled her activism ever since. Heather had been up since 5 a.m. preparing signs. She was tired, hot, and frustrated that their group had received little media attention despite weeks of demonstrations. When she saw John's uniform, the physical embodiment of everything she was protesting against, something inside her snapped. Without thinking through her actions, Heather grabbed her large iced coffee. She had barely touched the drink, and the plastic cup was still full and sweating in the summer heat. She broke away from the group and crossed the street with determined steps. John noticed the young woman approaching but thought nothing of it. People often came up to thank him when he wore his uniform, though it always made him uncomfortable. He was about to nod politely when he saw the anger in her eyes. "Do you know how many people died because of you?" Heather shouted, loud enough that heads turned all along the street. Before John could respond, Heather threw the entire cup of iced coffee directly at his chest. The lid popped off as it hit him, sending cold brown liquid splashing across his blue uniform, soaking his ribbons and medals. "Baby killer," she screamed, her face red with emotion. "How many civilians died for your medals?" The sudden cold wetness against his chest made John gasp. For a moment, he was transported back to Afghanistan. The sudden shock, the need to assess the threat, the feeling of being targeted. His heart raced and his hands trembled slightly before his mind caught up and reminded him he was on a street in Portland. Coffee dripped from his chest, creating a growing stain across the uniform he had so carefully prepared for Peter's memorial. The medals that represented years of service and sacrifice were now splattered and sticky. John stood completely still, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Around them, people reacted with shock. A woman at a nearby bus stop covered her mouth with her hand. A man sitting outside a cafe stood up so quickly he knocked over his chair. Several people immediately pulled out their phones and began recording. "What's wrong with you?" someone shouted at Heather. "She assaulted him," called another voice. Heather seemed momentarily startled by her own actions, but seeing the crowd's reaction, she doubled down. "You all just blindly worship the military without thinking about what they actually do," she shouted, looking around at the gathering crowd. "This uniform represents death and destruction." John still hadn't spoken. He took a deep breath and slowly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket. As he dabbed at the coffee on his chest, he noticed his hands were steady again. The initial shock had passed, and now he felt a strange sense of calm. Susan Baker had been enjoying her day off at her favorite cafe when she heard the commotion. As a police dispatcher, she was trained to notice details, and she immediately assessed the situation through the cafe window. She saw the veteran in his coffee-soaked uniform, the angry young woman, and the growing crowd that was quickly taking sides. Susan recognized the signs of a situation that could escalate dangerously. Instead of calling 911, Susan pulled out her phone and called her brother. Captain Frank Baker was spending his weekend leading National Guard drills at the Armory just 6 blocks away. "Frank, you need to get down to Main and Pine right now," Susan said urgently when he answered. "A protester just assaulted a veteran in uniform. The crowd is getting worked up." Outside, the situation was indeed getting worse. Several of Heather's fellow protesters had crossed the street to stand beside her, while others from the cafe and nearby shops had gathered around John. What had started as a one-on-one confrontation was quickly becoming a shouting match between two growing groups. "He fought for your right to protest," an older man yelled at Heather. "He fought for oil companies and defense contractors," a protester shouted back. John finally found his voice. "Please, everyone calm down," he said, his voice quiet but firm. People nearby fell silent, straining to hear him. "This isn't helping anything." He turned to face Heather directly. The coffee had soaked through to his skin, making the uniform cling uncomfortably to his chest, but John maintained his military posture. "I understand you're angry," he said to her. "You have every right to protest and speak your mind. That's part of what I swore to protect. But this," he gestured to his stained uniform, "this doesn't further your cause. It just creates more division." Heather stared at him, clearly surprised by his measured response. She had expected anger, maybe even violence. His calmness was unsettling, making her question her actions for the first time. "You don't know what we're fighting for," she said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "Then tell me," John replied. "I'm listening." The crowd around them had grown to about 50 people. Some were still filming, while others continued to argue among themselves. The simple act of a coffee thrown in anger had unleashed emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface of the community for a long time. What no one in the crowd realized was that in a nearby armory, 27 National Guard members were already boarding transport vehicles, responding to Susan's call to her brother. Within minutes, they would arrive and transform this volatile street corner in ways no one could predict. John Miller stood dripping with coffee, facing Heather Davis across a divide that seemed impossible to bridge. Neither of them knew that. Their confrontation was about to become much bigger than just the two of them. Susan Baker watched the scene unfold through the cafe window. Her half-eaten sandwich lay forgotten on her plate as she pressed her phone to her ear, eyes never leaving the confrontation outside. "Frank, I'm serious. This is getting bad," she said to her brother. "There's at least 50 people now, and they're choosing sides." Captain Frank Baker listened carefully to his sister's description. At 43, Frank had served in the National Guard for nearly 20 years. He had been deployed overseas twice but found his true calling in disaster relief and community support missions. Today, he had been leading a routine weekend training, exercise with his unit. What exactly happened? Frank asked, signaling to his second-in-command to come closer. A woman threw coffee at a veteran in his dress uniform, Susan explained. He's soaked, Frank. And he looks like he just came from a funeral or memorial. People are furious. Frank made his decision quickly. This wasn't technically within their jurisdiction. No official request for assistance had been made. But Frank knew his community. He knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. "We'll be there in 5, he said before hanging up. Frank addressed the 27 Guard members present for the weekend drill. "Listen up. We have a situation downtown. A veteran in uniform has been assaulted, and a crowd is forming. This is not an official activation, so participation is voluntary. We're going as community members who happen to be in uniform." He paused, looking at each face. Anyone who doesn't feel comfortable with this can stay behind. No questions asked, no judgment. The room was silent, no one moved. "Gear up," Frank said. "No weapons. We're peacekeepers today, not soldiers." Outside the cafe, the situation continued to deteriorate. More protesters had crossed the street to stand with Heather. Some bystanders had positioned themselves protectively, near John. The two groups faced each other, voices rising. "You disrespected a man who risked his life for you," shouted an elderly man, pointing a shaking finger at Heather. "We're protesting the system, not the individual." Another protester responded, trying to sound reasonable but struggling to be heard over the noise. John's uniform was beginning to dry in patches, the coffee creating stiff, dark stains across his chest. The sweet smell of it mixed unpleasantly with the summer heat. He continued trying to calm everyone down, but fewer people were listening now. "Please," John said, raising his voice slightly. "This isn't helping anything. We can talk about these issues without—" "Don't pretend you care about talking," Heather interrupted. Her initial shock at her own actions had been replaced by a defensive anger. If you really cared about people talking, you wouldn't have participated in silencing an entire country. A young man in a business suit stepped forward. "My brother died in Afghanistan," he said, his voice tight with emotion. He was trying to help people. "And how many Afghan brothers died?" a protester countered. The crowd grew larger as people from nearby shops and restaurants came out to see what was happening. Traffic slowed as drivers rubbernecked. Someone had called the local news station. More phones were raised, recording the confrontation. A police car turned onto the street, moving slowly through the gathering crowd. The sight of it caused the protesters to tense visibly. Some began to chant. Heather felt a mixture of emotions, swirling inside her. Part of her was horrified by what she had done. She had never physically confronted anyone before. Another part felt a strange exhilaration. She had finally done something that couldn't be ignored. And beneath it all was fear. Fear of arrest, fear of the consequences, and fear that her message would be lost in the drama of her actions. John noticed the police car and felt a new wave of dread. He didn't want Heather arrested. That would only deepen the divide he could feel growing by the minute. Despite the coffee attack, John understood anger. He had seen too much in Afghanistan not to understand how rage could build up and explode in unexpected ways. "Officer?" John called, raising his hand to get the policeman's attention as he stepped out of his car. "I don't want to press charges." The police officer looked surprised. He was young, maybe in his mid-20s, and clearly uncertain about how to handle the situation. "Sir, assault is a crime regardless of whether—" "I know," John interrupted gently. "But I'm asking you to focus on keeping everyone calm instead." Before the officer could respond, a new sound cut through the noise of the crowd. Two large vehicles were approaching from the north end of the street. They were dark green and unmistakably military. Susan, who had left the cafe to get closer to the action, felt relief wash over her. "Frank," she whispered. The two transport vehicles stopped at opposite ends of the block. Their doors opened, and National Guard members in uniform began to exit in an orderly fashion. Unlike the chaos of the crowd, they moved with disciplined precision. Captain Frank Baker was the first to approach the center of the confrontation. He walked with purpose, his uniform crisp and his expression calm but serious. People instinctively moved aside to let him through. "What's going on here?" Frank asked, though Susan had already briefed him on the situation. The young police officer looked relieved to see the guard. "Sir, I was just responding to a reported assault." Frank nodded and turned to John. "Are you all right, soldier?" John straightened automatically in the presence of a superior officer. "Yes, sir, just a little damp." Frank then looked at Heather, who had gone pale at the sight of so many uniforms. "And you, miss, what's your side of this story?" Heather swallowed hard. She had expected to be immediately handcuffed, not asked for her perspective. I threw my coffee at him," she admitted, her voice smaller than before. "I was angry about what his uniform represents." Frank nodded without judgment. "I see." Around them, something remarkable was happening. The National Guard members had formed a wide circle around the entire block. They stood at parade rest, facing outward, creating a visual boundary that separated the scene from the rest of the city. They made no aggressive moves and spoke to no one. They simply stood, a silent reminder of order. The effect was immediate. The shouting began to die down. People who had been yelling moments before now spoke in hushed tones. The presence of the guard didn't feel threatening. They carried no weapons, but it commanded respect. "What are they doing?" "Someone in?" the crowd asked. "Creating space," Frank answered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Space for cooler heads to prevail. A news van pulled up outside the guard's perimeter. A reporter and cameraman tried to push through, but the guard members politely asked them to wait. Inside the circle, Frank created a smaller space for John and Heather. "The two of you are at the center of this," he said quietly. "How would you like to resolve it?" John looked at his coffee-stained uniform, and then at Heather. "I'd like to talk," he said simply. "Just talk." Heather looked surprised again. "You want to talk to me after what I did?" John nodded. "Especially after what you did." Frank signaled to one of his guard members, who approached with a backpack. From it, he produced a clean guard t-shirt. "You might be more comfortable in this," Frank suggested to John. John considered the offer, then shook his head. "Thank you, sir, but no. These stains are now part of the conversation." Frank nodded with respect. "There's a coffee shop on the corner that's agreed to give you some privacy. My people will make sure you're not disturbed." As Frank led John and Heather toward the coffee shop, the crowd watched in silence. The narrative they had expected, arrest, more confrontation, maybe even violence, had been disrupted by this unexpected turn. Susan approached her brother as he returned from escorting John and Heather. "That was a risk," she said quietly. "Using the guard this way." Frank nodded. "Sometimes risks are necessary. I'd rather ask forgiveness than permission when it comes to preventing violence in our community." Inside the coffee shop, a barista led John and Heather to a small table in the back room, away from windows and curious eyes. She placed 2 cups of water on the table and quietly left them alone. John and Heather sat across from each other, the coffee stains on his uniform now, a dark, drying reminder of how their interaction had begun. For a long moment, neither spoke. "I'm listening," John finally said, breaking the silence. "Tell me why you're so angry." Heather looked down at her hands, then back up at John's face. Outside, the National Guard continued their silent vigil, creating a space where an unexpected conversation could begin. Heather stared at John across the small table in the back room of the coffee shop. The sounds of the crowd outside were muffled now, a distant hum beneath the quiet jazz music playing in the cafe. She took a sip of water, trying to gather her thoughts. "My cousin died in Afghanistan," she finally said. "He was 22. He joined the military because our family couldn't afford college for him. He wanted to be a teacher." John nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Don't say that," Heather snapped, some of her anger returning. "Everyone says that. It doesn't mean anything." "You're right," John agreed, surprising her again. Words don't help much with grief. I lost friends over there too. Heather leaned forward. Then how can you still wear that uniform? How can you be proud of something that caused so much death? John was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. The uniform doesn't represent what you think it does. At least not to me. It's not about war or politics. It's about the people who serve, the promises we make to each other. Promises to kill for oil companies? Heather challenged. John didn't rise to the bait. I joined because I believed I could help protect people who couldn't protect themselves. That's what I tried to do every day I served. But don't you see? Heather pressed. That's what they tell you to make you feel better about what you're really doing, securing American interests abroad. It's just a nice way of saying you're fighting for money and power. Outside the coffee shop, Captain Frank Baker was dealing with the growing media presence. 3 news vans had arrived and reporters were shouting questions at him from beyond the guard's perimeter. Captain, did you mobilize the National Guard? Without proper authorization. Is this an official response to the protest? Are you planning to make arrests? Frank approached the reporters calmly. This is not an official Guard operation. My unit happened to be training nearby when we learned of a situation that threatened to escalate. We're simply creating space for a peaceful resolution. But you're in uniform, using Guard vehicles, a reporter pointed out. We came as we were, Frank replied. Sometimes the right thing to do isn't in the rule book. The young police officer who had first responded was now speaking with his sergeant, who had arrived at the scene. The sergeant looked unhappy. Baker has no authority to deploy like this, the sergeant said. This could cause problems. With all due respect, sir, the young officer replied, they've managed to calm everything down without a single arrest or injury. Back in the coffee shop, John and Heather's conversation had taken an unexpected turn. Tell me about your cousin, John said. What was his name? Heather seemed caught off guard by the personal question. Eric. His name was Eric. And he wanted to be a teacher? Heather nodded, her anger momentarily forgotten. A high school history teacher. He was really good with kids. I bet he was, John said gently. I served with many people like Eric. Good people who joined for all kinds of reasons. College money, family tradition, wanting to make a difference. But don't you feel used? Heather asked, genuinely curious now. When you look back at what happened over there, don't you feel like you were sent to fight for reasons that had nothing to do with what they told you? John looked down at his coffee-stained uniform. Sometimes, he admitted. The politics are complicated and I don't pretend to understand all of it, but that's not what gets me up in the morning. What does, Heather asked. The people I served with, the promises we made to each other, and the good we tried to do even in terrible situations. John paused, then added, I was at a memorial service today, for my friend Peter. We served together. Heather's face fell. I threw coffee on you after a memorial service? John nodded. Peter died of cancer last week. We made it through 3 tours together and then cancer took him in 6 months. Shame washed over Heather's face. I'm sorry, she said, and this time it sounded genuine. I didn't know. How could you have known? John replied. You saw a uniform, not a person. The words hung in the air between them. Outside, the situation was evolving. A senior police officer had arrived and was speaking with Captain Baker. Frank, you know this isn't by the book, the police captain said. They had known each other for years through joint emergency response training. I know, Bill, Frank admitted, but it's working. They're talking in there. The police captain looked at the Guard members standing in their perfect circle, then at the now calm crowd. Many people had dispersed once the immediate drama ended, though a core group remained, including most of the protesters and some curious onlookers. You have 20 minutes, the police captain finally said. Then I need your people to stand down properly. This can't become a precedent. Frank nodded gratefully. Understood. Susan approached her brother after the police captain left. That was close, she said. Do you think 20 minutes is enough? Frank looked toward the coffee shop. It will have to be. Inside, Heather was asking John about his experiences. Something had shifted in their conversation. The initial anger had given way to cautious curiosity. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "Every day," John answered honestly. "Anyone who says they weren't afraid over there is lying. Then why stay?" "Because sometimes the things that scare us are the same things that matter most." John took a breath. "I didn't agree with everything about the war. I still don't. But I believe in showing up for people who need help, even when it's dangerous, even when it's complicated." Heather was quiet for a moment. "My protest group started because we want to help people too," she said. "We believe the military budget could be used for education, healthcare, things people need here." John nodded. "That's a fair perspective. I've seen how other countries struggle with basics we take for granted. But I've also seen what happens when there's no one willing to stand up against violence." "So where does that leave us?" Heather asked. "We both think we're right." "Maybe we're both partly right," John suggested. "And maybe the real problem is that we stop listening to each other." A soft knock at the door interrupted them. The barista poked her head in. "Sorry to bother you, but the guard captain says they need to leave soon. The police are asking them to stand down." John thanked her, then turned back to Heather. "I should probably go home and change." Heather looked at the stains on his uniform with renewed regret. "I really am sorry about your uniform. And for what I said." "Apology accepted," John said simply. "What happens now?" Heather asked as they stood to leave. "That depends," John replied. "Do you want this to be the end of our conversation, or the beginning?" Heather considered the question. "I think maybe the beginning." They walked out of the coffee shop together. The scene outside had transformed during their conversation. Most of the crowd had dispersed. The National Guard members still stood in their circle, but they were preparing to leave. News cameras swiveled to capture John and Heather emerging together. Captain Baker approached them. "Everything all right here?" John nodded. "Yes, sir, thank you for the intervention." "Just doing our job," Frank replied, though they all knew that wasn't entirely true. The young police officer came over. "Sir," he said to John, "do you want to file a report about the assault?" Before John could answer, Heather spoke. "I did assault him. I'll accept whatever consequences come with that." John shook his head. "That's not necessary. We've worked it out." The police officer looked between them, clearly confused by this unexpected outcome. "Are you sure, sir?" "I'm sure," John confirmed. As the National Guard began to board their vehicles and the police started to disperse the remaining onlookers, a reporter pushed forward with a microphone. "Can either of you tell us what happened here today?" she asked. John and Heather exchanged a look. "We had a conversation," John said simply. "A real one," Heather added. As the sun began to set over Portland, casting long shadows across the street, John Miller and Heather Davis stood side by side in front of the news cameras. The coffee stains on John's uniform had dried completely now, creating a dark map across his chest, a reminder of how their unlikely connection had begun. The next morning, John Miller woke to the sound of his phone buzzing repeatedly. He reached for it with eyes still half closed and saw dozens of notifications. The coffee incident had gone viral overnight. John sat up in bed and began scrolling, through messages from friends, family, and even strangers who had somehow found his social media accounts. There were news articles with headlines like "Veteran Attacked at Protest" and "National Guard Surrounds City Block After Assault." Some of the stories painted him as a hero. Others questioned the guard's response, but almost all of them missed what had actually happened. None of them mentioned the conversation in the coffee shop. Across town, Heather Davis was experiencing a similar morning. Her phone had been ringing since 6 a.m. Fellow protesters, angry veterans, and news reporters all wanted to speak with her. She had turned it off after the third call and buried it under a pillow. Heather sat at her small kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in front of her. Her roommate Lisa watched her with concern. "You're all over the news," Lisa said gently. "Are you okay?" Heather shook her head. "I messed up, Lisa, really messed up." The coffee thing? Not just that, I judged him without knowing anything about him. He was coming from a memorial service for his friend and I threw coffee on him. Heather's voice cracked slightly. What kind of person does that make me? Lisa sat down across from her. The kind who makes mistakes, like everyone else. Heather's phone buzzed from beneath the pillow. She ignored it. What are you going to do? Lisa asked. Heather thought about her conversation with John, about the unexpected understanding in his eyes when she told him about her cousin. I think I need to talk to him again. Meanwhile, Captain Frank Baker was facing the consequences of his actions. He sat in his commanding officer's office, back straight, eyes forward. Colonel Patricia Williams studied him from across her desk. Unofficial deployment of National Guard resources. Use of Guard vehicles without proper authorization. 27 personnel in uniform acting without orders. She set down the paper she was reading from. Care to explain yourself, Captain? Frank met her gaze. I made a judgment call, ma'am. A situation was escalating downtown that threatened to become violent. My unit was nearby and in a position to help. By forming a perimeter around a city block, that's not standard procedure for a judgment call, Captain. No, ma'am, but it worked. No one was hurt. No arrests were made. A potentially explosive situation was diffused. Colonel Williams leaned back in her chair. The mayor called me this morning. So did 3 news stations. Do you know what the headline is on the Portland Daily? Guard takes over downtown block. That doesn't exactly inspire public confidence in how we operate. Frank nodded. I understand, ma'am. I accept full responsibility. The colonel was quiet for a moment. The thing is, Baker, I've also received calls from people who were there, a cafe owner, a bus driver, the police captain. All of them said the same thing, that your unit handled the situation with remarkable restraint and professionalism. Frank remained silent, waiting. There will be an official reprimand in your file, Colonel Williams finally said, and you'll be conducting training sessions on proper protocol for the next 6 weekends. But between us, I might have done the same thing in your position. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. The press wants a statement. You'll be giving it. Across town, John had decided to get some fresh air. The coffee stains hadn't come out of his uniform despite his best efforts, and the memory of yesterday was still fresh in his mind. He changed into jeans and a simple blue t-shirt and headed to a small park near his apartment. John sat on a bench, watching children play on the swings. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. This is Heather. From yesterday. The police officer gave me your number. I hope that's okay. Can we talk again? John stared at the message, surprised. He hesitated only briefly before replying. Yes, same coffee shop? 2 p.m.? 3 dots appeared, then, I'll be there. John put his phone away and continued watching the children play. A little girl was being pushed on the swing by her father, squealing with delight each time she went higher. The simple joy of the moment made John smile. His thoughts drifted to Peter, to the memorial service, to the friend he would never see again. Then to Heather, to their conversation, to the unexpected connection they had formed in the midst of conflict. Life was strange that way. Pain and healing often came from the same unexpected places. At the local news station, a young reporter named Amy Chen was reviewing footage from yesterday's incident. Unlike most of her colleagues, she wasn't satisfied with the surface-level story. Something about the way the veteran and the protester had emerged from the coffee shop together had caught her attention. There's more here, she told her producer. Everyone's focusing on the coffee throwing and the guard response, but look at them when they come out. She pointed to the footage. They're not enemies anymore. Her producer shrugged. The conflict is the story, Amy. Guard oversteps, protester attacks veteran, that's what gets clicks. But what if the real story is what happened afterward in that coffee shop? Then find it, her producer challenged. But the segment airs at 6, with or without your angle. Amy grabbed her recorder and headed out the door. She had 4 hours to find John Miller and Heather Davis. At 1:55 p.m., Heather arrived at the coffee shop. She had changed her outfit 3 times before settling on a simple green dress, as far from protest attire as she could get. She wanted John to see her as a person, not just a protester. The same barista from yesterday recognized her and smiled. "Back so soon?" Heather nodded, feeling embarrassed. "Is the back room available again?" "For you two?" "Absolutely. Your conversation is the talk of the shop." Heather ordered 2 coffees and took a seat in the back room. She checked her phone nervously. Her protest group had been calling and texting nonstop. Some were supportive, others felt she had betrayed the cause by talking to the enemy. She had stopped reading the messages after a while. At exactly 2 p.m., John walked in. He spotted Heather and headed toward the back room. As he sat down, she pushed one of the coffees toward him. "I figured I owed you a replacement," she said, with a small smile. John accepted it with a nod. "Thanks. How are you holding up?" "My phone won't stop ringing. Everyone has an opinion about what happened." She paused. "How about you?" "Same. Apparently we're famous now, for all the wrong reasons." Heather looked down at her coffee. "I want to apologize again, for real this time. Not just for the coffee, but for what I said. For not seeing you as a person." John nodded slowly. Apology accepted. Again. They sat in silence for a moment, sipping their coffees. "So," John finally said, "where do we go from here?" Before Heather could answer, there was a knock at the door. The barista opened it slightly. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's a reporter here asking to speak with both of you. Amy Chen from Channel 8 News. Should I send her away?" John and Heather exchanged a look. "What do you think?" John asked. "Another conversation might be good." Heather considered it, then nodded. "Okay, but we do it together." "Together," John agreed. The barista showed Amy in. The young reporter seemed nervous but determined. "Thank you both for seeing me. Everyone is talking about what happened yesterday, but no one seems to be talking about what happened between you two in this room. I think that might be the real story." John and Heather exchanged another look. "It might be," Heather said cautiously. "Would you be willing to tell me about it?" Amy asked, setting her recorder on the table. John thought for a moment. "On one condition. You have to tell the whole story, not just the parts that get clicks." Amy nodded eagerly. "That's exactly what I want to do." "Then I think we're ready to talk," John said, looking at Heather, who nodded in agreement. As Amy began her interview, Captain Frank Baker was standing before microphones and cameras preparing to give his statement about the guard's actions. Susan stood at the back of the room, giving her brother a supportive nod. "Yesterday, members of my unit responded to a situation that threatened public safety," Frank began. "Our actions were not by the book. They were based on a human assessment of a human situation. Sometimes that's what's needed most." Across town, in a small back room of a coffee shop, 2 unlikely companions began sharing their story with a reporter who wanted to hear more than just the conflict. It was the beginning of something none of them could have anticipated, a conversation that would soon extend far beyond Portland. 3 weeks after the coffee incident, John Miller stood in front of his bathroom mirror adjusting his tie. This time he wore a simple dark blue suit instead of his uniform. The coffee-stained uniform now hung in a glass case in his living room, a reminder of how quickly life could change. John's phone buzzed with a text from Heather. "Nervous?" He smiled and texted back, "A little you?" "Terrified. See you there." John slipped his phone into his pocket and took a deep breath. Today, he and Heather would be speaking at the community center to an audience of veterans, protesters, and curious citizens. What had started as a viral moment of conflict had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. Amy Chen's news story had aired 3 weeks ago. Unlike the other coverage, her piece had focused on what happened after the coffee was thrown, the conversation that took place in the back room of the coffee shop. She had titled it, "Enemies to Allies: How a Moment of Anger Led to Understanding." The story had resonated far beyond Portland. Across town, Heather Davis was also getting ready. She stood in her bedroom, looking at the simple black dress she had laid out on her bed. Her roommate Lisa leaned against the doorframe. "Big day," Lisa said. Heather nodded. "I never thought this would happen. Any of it." In the 3 weeks since the incident, Heather had received hundreds of messages, some from fellow protesters who felt betrayed, others from veterans who were surprised and moved by her willingness to listen and learn. The hardest message had come from her aunt, the mother of her cousin Eric, who had died in Afghanistan. That conversation had lasted hours and left them both in tears, but somehow closer than before. At the Portland National Guard Armory, Captain Frank Baker was in his office. The official reprimand was in his file as promised, but something unexpected had also happened. Letters of support had poured in from the community. The mayor, who had initially condemned the Guard's actions, had publicly thanked Frank for his innovative approach to community peacekeeping. There was a knock at his door. Susan entered with a smile. "Ready to go?" Frank nodded. "Just finishing up some paperwork." "Everyone's talking about the community center event," Susan said. "It's completely sold out." Frank smiled. Who would have thought a cup of coffee could lead to all this? At Channel 8 News, Amy Chen was preparing to cover the community center
event. Her producer stopped by her desk. "Good work on the follow-up pieces," he said grudgingly. "Ratings have been excellent." Amy tried not to look too pleased.
After her initial story about John and Heather's conversation had aired, she had produced a series of pieces exploring the divisions in their community and the unexpected bridges being built. The response had been overwhelming. "Thanks," she said. "I'm heading to the community center now for the forum." "Get good footage," her producer said. "This story has legs." The Portland Community Center was packed by the time John arrived. He made his way through the crowd, stopping occasionally when people recognized him. Most were supportive, though some veterans still questioned his decision not to press charges against Heather. John listened politely, but kept moving. He found Heather backstage pacing nervously. When she saw him, her face broke into a relieved smile. "There you are," she said. "I was afraid you might have changed your mind." John shook his head. "Not a chance." The last 3 weeks had been strange and wonderful. He and Heather had met several times, each conversation going deeper than the last. They had visited Peter's widow together. They had spoken with Heather's protest group. They had even started planning a joint initiative to support both veterans and refugee families, finding common ground in their desire to help those affected by war. A community center staff member approached them. "5 minutes until we start. The mayor just arrived and Captain Baker is here with some of his Guard members." John and Heather nodded. They had prepared for this event carefully, but both knew that some things couldn't be scripted. Out in the audience, Frank and Susan took their seats near the front. Several of Frank's Guard unit members were scattered throughout the room, there to show support for what had become an unexpected mission of peace. "Did you ever imagine this would happen when you called me that day?" Frank asked his sister. Susan shook her head. "I just wanted to prevent a riot. I never thought it would lead to whatever this is." "Understanding," Frank said simply. "That's what this is." The lights dimmed slightly and the mayor of Portland stepped onto the stage. She welcomed everyone and spoke briefly about the importance of civil discourse and community healing. Then she introduced John and Heather. They walked onto the stage, together. John in his blue suit, Heather in her black dress. So different from how they had first appeared to each other. He in uniform, she in protest clothes. The audience applauded politely, though there was tension in the room. Not everyone was convinced by this display of unity. John spoke first, telling his story simply and honestly. He talked about Peter, about his years in the service, about his complicated feelings regarding the wars he had fought in. He described the moment the coffee hit his chest and how his first reaction had been shock, not anger. Then Heather spoke. She talked about her cousin Eric, about her fears and frustrations, about the moment she decided to throw her coffee. She admitted her shame, not just for the act itself, but for seeing a uniform instead of a person. I judged John based on what I thought he represented, she said. I never stopped to consider that he might be as complex and thoughtful about these issues as I try to be. John returned to the microphone, and I realized that Heather's anger, while misdirected at me personally, came from a place of real pain and legitimate questions about our country's choices. Together they described their conversation in the coffee shop and the unexpected connection they had formed. We didn't end up agreeing on everything, Heather explained. We still don't, but we learned to listen to each other. And to see each other as people first, John added, not as symbols or enemies. They opened the floor for questions. Some were supportive, others challenging. A veteran asked Heather how she could justify her actions. A protester asked John if he still supported military interventions abroad. They answered honestly, sometimes deferring to each other, modeling the respectful dialogue they were advocating for. Captain Baker was called on and stood to speak. I made a split-second decision that day to create space for conversation instead of conflict. I'd like to know, what do you think made that conversation possible? What allowed you to move past the anger? John and Heather exchanged a look. Curiosity, John said after a moment. I was genuinely curious about why Heather was so angry. I wanted to understand, not win. And courage, Heather added. It took courage for John to listen rather than react. It took courage for me to admit I was wrong. As the forum continued, Amy Chen filmed from the side of the stage. This wasn't just a good story anymore. It was something important, something that needed to be shared beyond Portland. After the event, John and Heather stood outside the community center. The coffee-stained uniform, now carefully preserved and framed, was displayed in the lobby as a reminder of how their journey began. What now? Heather asked as they watched people leaving, many deep in conversation. Now we keep talking, John said, and more importantly, we keep listening. They had already been invited to speak at schools, churches, and community groups across the state. The governor had called yesterday to discuss a potential statewide initiative based on their experience. What had begun with a moment of anger had transformed into something neither of them could have imagined. As the sun set over Portland, John Miller and Heather Davis stood side by side, no longer defined by a uniform or a protest sign, but by their willingness to see beyond their differences and find common ground in their shared humanity. The National Guard had encircled the block for just 8 minutes that day 3 weeks ago. But the circle of understanding that had begun in that coffee shop was still expanding, one conversation at a time.